You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. I'm just sitting here entertaining myself, looking at this story, and it came out yesterday. So we're recording on Thursday, and it came out on Wednesday, I believe. And it first thing that got me laughing so it's about ransomware, right? Which is the gift that keeps on giving to people who do a information security related podcast. But this was about the R Evil or Revil, as I like to, the shorthand uh, ransomware gang, and it talked about their business model, right? It's ransomware as a service, or RAS, kind of like SaaS, or kind of like IDaaS or Paz. It's got an official name now. But the real punchline of the story was apparently they created a backdoor in their software, in their ransomware software, so they can steal from their affiliates. So the people who actually conduct the ransomware attacks, they go and they can kind of take over the ransomware attack and take over the extortion of money and then steal all the money for themselves. So imagine that, thieves stealing from thieves.
That's so hard to imagine. I mean, criminals not being, people of their word. I get it, right? I mean, criminals stealing from each other, it's kind of an age-old tale, right? You hear the double cross, the triple cross, right? It's all in movies and stuff like that. But if I'm building ransomware as a service, anything as a service, I would want that service to be solid, reliable, and I'd want people to use it. I feel like they're shooting themselves in the foot here, right? If it worked really well and there wasn't this concern about being stolen from by other thieves, wouldn't you, in the long run, potentially make more money? Or are they just taken for the? I mean, I guess maybe if they're, a blip, right? They don't want to be operating that long, so they're harder to trace. Get as much as they can, siphon off, just fractions of a penny, and then pull it into your own account, and then you disappear. I mean, I can see both sides of it, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean the real interesting angle of this is that it seems like the criminal ransomware underworld kind of sent out the message like, we're not going to attack vital infrastructure or key infrastructure. So a lot of the attacks have been on what's considered like not pipelines or not defense. In other words, to not create a international issue between the United States and Russia, for example. And so they're very concerned with kind of staying out of the spotlight from that standpoint. But they'll go ahead and do something like this and kind of stab their own affiliates in the back. But I'm sure this is one of those situations where they created this back door and thought nobody would ever know about it. Some security researcher was able to uncover it. I'm not sure exactly how they've uncovered it.
It's a system designed by humans, just like anything else. Someone will find some way around whatever process or security is put in place. And I think it's interesting that you're talking about the who's getting attacked at this point, and the whole thing around international incidents and things like that. I mean, that certainly came up when the pipeline was hacked in the U.S. And I think it makes sense, right? You want to stay under the radar. If you start attacking critical infrastructure, you probably get a lot more resources thrown at you. But there was also a recent story in, I think it was Alabama. There was a hospital that went through a ransomware incident, and a baby ended up dying. And they think that it had something to do with the ransomware because it took down, care units and vitals and things like that. The medical staff there would have relied on to like check for different conditions and things like that. So
Yeah, I mean, from what I heard, the baby was on some kind of device that was monitoring them, and then the system was unable to send the alerts to the staff that the baby was having trouble. I mean, yeah, it's the sickening side effect of this, and it's why it shouldn't really be taken lightly. The whole angle of, I think, where this thing is going is, if criminal groups were stealing money out of banks, or doing things in kind of a traditional um a traditional crime, from a traditional crime perspective, not cyber, it seems like the government would take a much more heavy-handed approach. So I think that's the direction this is going to end up going.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, the government certainly got involved with the pipeline stuff, but it's all this shadow spy computer hacking. Everyone's doing it to each other, so whatever. But at the end of the day, it's a concern for everybody out there, whether it's a direct impact to your organization or maybe even just as a customer of an organization somehow of a someone who gets breached, right? What if that was your kid that was in the hospital and the hospital can't operate at its normal or expected capacity and effectiveness, and it was because of ransomware? Do you care at that point? No. You probably want answers, and you want justice and retribution and all that good stuff. So it's an interesting time we live in, for sure. I think that's why we're seeing a lot more focus played on security when it comes to ransomware. You and I are going to be giving a talk about it at Authenticate conference in a couple of weeks. But we've seen a lot of organizations really start to kind of take it a little more seriously, because I don't think it's generally ransomware is not a targeted attack. It's a shotgun blast, and they're kind of looking for the lowest hanging fruit, to try and cherry take the easy cherries off the tree, or pick up the easy apples, whatever metaphor you want to use. If someone's targeting you, they're targeting you. But if it's a shotgun blast, they're just kind of looking for the easy stuff. So it's a little bit like the Ricky Bobby quote: "If you're not first, you're last." It's more like this: if you're not last, you're first in this scenario. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about it right now.
Yeah, yeah, you're right on it. So, to repeat, that presentation we're giving at the FIDO Alliance conference is on the 19th. We're also doing a webinar. Jeff, I'm assuming you can link to it in the show notes, but that webinar is on the 14th of October, 2021. So, I guess depending on when you're listening to this, we should put the year in there as well. So, hopefully, people can check it out.
Yep, it's a productivity webinar, so it'll be on demand. Obviously, we don't do too many commercials, but because it's Jim and I actually doing something along with our friend Pierce, who's also been on the show as well, we figure we'll plug it there. So yeah, October 14th. I'll put a link in the show notes for people to kind of check that out if they want to. And then yeah, busy speaking schedule for you and I in the next couple of weeks between that, and then going to Seattle and meeting our identity friends and giving a talk there as well. So that'll be kind of cool. Or hopefully we'll be able to record some episodes there, and have some interesting chats with some of the identirati, so to speak, who may be on site.
Absolutely. Well, I'm already tired of talking. So, what do you say we bring our guests into the picture?
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit off the direction that we're going to go today, and I think that's as a service, right? So now we're talking about the cloud and things like that. So we're kind of thinking here, brainstorming before we started the shows. All right, so what do we call this? And I like the idea that you came up with is the cloud is different. So, what does that mean? So, to help us with that conversation, we've got our friend John Morton. He's the Director of Solutions Engineering at Britive. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much for joining us. And it's tradition around here that when someone joins us for the first time, that they tell us how they got into the identity space, or maybe when they first realized that they were in the identity space. So maybe you can kind of take us through your origin story of how did you end up at Britive, and what was is identity something that you chose, or did it choose you?
That's a wild and intriguing story of submarines, espionage, and tons of activity. So I wouldn't say I chose identity by any means, right? I started off in the U.S. Navy in the submarine fleet, special projects, undersea research and development. I worked on the USS Jimmy Carter, a General Dynamics electric boat. Any of your listeners have some free time and want to look up some funny, interesting, and very cool stuff, go ahead and pivot there. And then I bounced around the federal space, Veterans Affairs, the Postal Service, and ended up in finance at Oppenheimer Funds, all as a defender, right? And while at Oppenheimer Funds, this was about a little more than 10 years ago or so, I was working on a couple different projects, very agile, and ended up with a product, POCing a product called Avexa. That was an identity and access management product that really helped, with what we were doing there. Made some great connections with the folks who were selling Avexa as a startup, and the rest was history.
And now you're with Brightive. So one of the things that I think is interesting in this market is what Brightive kind of works on, which is, I guess, to sum it up, is KEAM, or Cloud Identity and Entitlement Management. Maybe you can kind of tell us a little bit about Britive, because I'm not sure if people might be as familiar with kind of what it is you guys do and the problems you're trying to solve. And maybe I oversimplified it. Maybe there's more to it than that.
No, you nailed it, Jeff. And I've chatted with Jim, both of you, a little bit about it. And I like the title of the show. The cloud is fundamentally different, right? So what Brightive is trying to do is, taking a lot of the traditional cloud access management ideas and applying them to the cloud. It's just not going to work. So what we're trying to do is leverage the new cloud ecosystem in managing access when it comes to authorization of privileges and really adapting to the way things work now. And I'm sure when I bring up key things like role mining, that's a pain in every IAM's person's neck. Anyone who's ever tried to do that, it's literally almost impossible. The cloud really changes those capabilities. So it's playing on that theme of how do we take what the cloud is now and apply access management in a new way.
Yeah, I feel like role-based access control is something that every organization says they want to do until they realize how hard it is. And they maybe get part of the way done, and then they're like, all right, I think we're okay. We're not going to kind of finish it off.
We have
And it just kind of
enough roles.
stagnates.
We
Yeah,
have enough
exactly.
far back. Let's try ABAC. That might be better.
Right. So it's an interesting space to be, because I'm seeing, we're seeing a lot of vendors kind of come up in this space. And I think one of the things that I always am curious about, and Jim had a great question, we were kind of talking about this before we hit record, is, so who's the person that you're looking to sell to? Is it engineering? Is it a CISO? Is it kind of anybody who will listen? Like, who's the target audience for, like, who's going to get really excited about, oh yeah, that is pretty cool, we need something like that?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And that's part of the fun of being at a startup for anybody who's ever worked in startup culture. That show Silicon Valley does a great job of who are we trying to sell to? What's our ideal customer profile, right? I can talk for hours about that. But in all reality, when it comes to cloud access management, I would love to sell to CISOs. I would. I really would. At the end of the day, they do end up buying our product. But who we actually hit the most traction with is CTOs and CIOs. Those folks who are responsible for the trajectory of an organization. A lot of vendors forget that businesses, they exist to make money, right? And security is just one aspect of that. So when we show CTOs and CIOs, and mainly I like to call them builders, this is a new term I'm developing. By builder, I mean cloud ops, cloud platform ops. Go through LinkedIn. You guys can probably have a whole topic about this later, about what titles exist as it relates to cloud, and they're all over the map. So I've been classifying them as builders, DevOps, DevSecOps, who are saying, we have an initiative to build in the cloud. We have an initiative to build fast, and we would like to do this securely. That is who ideally we do the best with. They see our product, they understand the cloud is different, they're ready to get there. What they do is they call the IAM team and the security team, and unfortunately, they're a little bit behind in the understanding. So there's a bit of education. Once we can get those buyers aligned, there's a lot of success. Does that help, Jeff? Jim, should I explain that anymore?
No, that's helpful. And I guess, how is this different than traditional privilege access management? I
Great
immediately
question.
think of things like on-prem, and obviously the cloud is different, but you've got behemoths in the space between Thycotic and CyberArk and BeyondTrust and others. Why do I need a separate product to manage my cloud when I already have CyberArk, or I already have SailPoint or Savient or whatever it may be doing some sort of entitlements management?
Yep.
What's the missing piece of that puzzle that's where you guys come in?
The age-old cloud journey story, right? So what's really different fundamentally is when people end up using the cloud for what it was intended for, it is not a place to just lift and shift hardware. People start to realize that there are no more servers in the cloud, and they put their hands up like an emoji, the shrugging emoji of what are we supposed to do now? That's the problem that Britive solves. In the cloud, whether it's a cloud service provider, infrastructure as a service, SaaS as a service, there's all these new offerings, and they literally operate fundamentally different than your traditional server, right? A server had an understanding. There are users that can log in. Those users have passwords. Those users have roles that can be assigned. The cloud is a fundamentally different place where there are ephemeral services, nodes, functions that exist temporarily as entities to execute tasks. They are not the same as on-premise.
So I want to put a little bit of a box around this. So when we talk about the cloud, first off, we're not talking about ransomware as a service, right? We're not even talking about software as a service. What we're really talking about here are infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. So
Right.
AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud, et cetera, et cetera. Um,
Hmm.
what are some of the major differences between those different platforms? Because I mean, I'm starting from a point of let's look at this from an educational standpoint. You
Hmm.
know, talk to us about the differences between those platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. So infrastructure as a service is actually a really great place to start. And this is what I like to do in educating my identity teams. They are radically different between even the top four that you just mentioned, Jim. So let's look at it this way, right? AWS, in my opinion, and in Builder's opinion, remember John Morton's definition of builders, is a race car. You want to build things to support your organization like apps. Everyone has an app on their phone. Whoever builds a better app faster wins. AWS is the race car that will get you there. What does that mean? That means it is very fast. It has no seat belts. Controls are whatever you happen to put in it, but you would like to keep your race car light because that's how you win the race, right? AWS is a lot like that. There are entirely new capabilities like role assumption I'll come back to, where you do not even need user accounts or passwords to access resources. My identity folks out there listening to this podcast, mind probably blown that you do not need a user account or a password to access resources. Then you have an Azure. I like to think of Azure in this same car theme as a minivan. Very safe, very secure, very structured. It has seat belts, it has child safety locks, it has anything a happy, proud new mother would want to move her family to, somewhere. It's very secure. It's going to pass audit. It drives the speed limits, right? It is capable of things like using directories. It latches on to on-premise directories to kind of give you that warm, comfy feeling. Okay. My favorite of all is Google. Google is a rocket ship. GCP solves problems around artificial intelligence and machine learning, meaning that its architecture is such that it is designed to literally go to the moon. Those who understand it can manipulate it and use it well, and it is good at doing certain things. But when you're talking about a seatbelt on a rocket ship versus a minivan versus a race car, entirely different. OCI, it took a lot of everything that's out there and it kind of combined them together, right? It's a little bit of a minivan, a little bit of a race car, a little bit of a rocket ship, but it said, we're just going to focus on data. We're going to focus on databases and helping folks there. So even at its most basic layer, I gave you just a map of 4 of the different infrastructure of a service solutions, making some close analogies. There are drastic differences.
So you touched on an interesting topic there. So the idea that some of these clouds don't have accounts, they don't have usernames and passwords. They use something I know because we already talked. They use entities, right? So AWS and Oracle Cloud Infrastructure use entities. Talk to us a little bit. What does that mean? What's the difference?
Yeah, it's a really cool feature function, and I'll speak more about AWS than OCI, but OCI I'll highlight too. Is they have this idea. It's called role assumption. You can look this up in any of our listeners here, but basically in any IAM, so they call it AWS IAM, and this is a very different thing too, is the vernacular across the cloud. So I'm going to do my best to educate our listeners here about the vernacular of the crowd. So in AWS, when we talk about different environments, they actually call them AWS accounts. My IAM listeners, my identity listeners' minds are probably blown. What a terrible name, right? AWS account. But this is what they call environments. Within AWS accounts, you have the ability to manage IAM, which surprisingly they call AWS IAM. Within IAM, you have your traditional concepts of user accounts, groups, roles, policies, and inline policies. This is where we start to deviate and where that mixture of common words like policy and account can be very confounding and confusing for my identity and security teams, right? So at the end of the day, what happens is in AWS, you can build a resource, let's say an EC2 environment. You can give user accounts access to that resource by way of what's called a policy. A policy is just an overarching method of an account being able to access that resource, EC2. And within that, you can have things like roles. Roles are the traditional sense of a role. You have a set of permissions like EC2 admin. What AWS allows you to do, though, is it says if you have a resource in your AWS account called EC2 full access as a role, any entity with access provided by an identity provider can assume that role. Why this is a huge advantage is you are creating a temporary session with a set of secrets that are associated with that role assumption. All that means is that whole concept of tokenized access, we're creating a secret that operates within the boundaries of the policy that attaches to the role. That was a whole lot of stuff to explain one very basic scenario of EC2 and AWS.
I think that's it's the vernacular gets confusing.
Correct.
Like you said, with AWS, an account, a company could have 10 accounts. And it's basically, they're like billing accounts, right? I mean, it's a pocket of resources that you pay for. It's an invoice that you get. It has nothing to do with identity and access management per se.
Correct.
So, yeah, I think that's that's the interesting starting point. They probably, took all that into account when they came up with this. Now, something we talked about is, I love when somebody has a perspective on something, right? That's bold and brash and kind of goes against the grain. And this is one that you had because I even said, look, I think for most IT or IM programs or groups or however you're organized, you want visibility, right? And your angle that you said is history is not relevant to what's happening now. So I said, well, let me see what's happening. Let me have like a detective view into what's happening. Your perspective is that's not really what's important.
Right. Yeah. So I like to think of it as, visibility, it matters. It does. There are aspects for it. We want to be able to do things. But imagine you go to a diner and you sit down at the table and the waitress comes over and she says, "Hey, Jim, Jeff, welcome. Here are our specials from yesterday, what we had for breakfast." And you guys showed up expecting a steak dinner, right? How's that helpful? So visibility can tell you the things that might have happened that did happen, but it's always chasing after some objective, right? Where what these folks are trying to accomplish and the benefits of the cloud are we want to move very agile. We want to be fast, but we want to be secure. Can we leverage new capabilities like this sort of ephemeral connection in AWS to do what I need to do? Here's a prime example. I kind of mapped out the two bodies that we like to sell to, or that Britive is a fan of. Just anybody really in the cloud, which is you have security and IAM teams who already have these systems, and you have builders who just want to do something. Have you ever asked a builder if they care about visibility? They don't. They just want it to work. They want it to work fast, effectively, secure. And when you start to bubble up in the chain, although security matters, although IAM matters, these programs matter, they're constantly being perceived by the builders as a roadblock to what they're trying to accomplish. And visibility is that. If you take a report to those guys today or ladies and you say, "Look at all this bad stuff you did," chances are that environment in the cloud doesn't exist anymore. They look at you as a negative aspect to what they're tasked with accomplishing in their own KPIs, right? So we want to bridge that gap. We want to bring that back and say, can we make access management feasible, automated, easy, fast to satisfy both sides of that fence?
Well, you also never ask a builder, John, is do they see the value in project management?
Right.
Because you get a pretty clear answer. Yeah.
That is
so if you've been in IT long enough, you know what I'm talking about. So another one where you have kind of a strong against the grain position is you're a big fan of least privilege, right?
Yep.
Or is it
not
zero
exactly
standing? Yeah.
I am a fan of zero privilege.
I snookered you in there, right?
No, this is another huge talking point, and it's like Jim has a bone, and he's just like, "Hey, dangle it in front of me," right? He's like, "John, go ahead and take it." So least privilege is a great idea, but here's my beef with least privilege. It is very human centric. What's the other difference that I talk about a lot with the cloud? We want to move fast at the speed of service identities, at the speed of machines. When you are trying to analyze least privilege from some sort of visibility, and you have potentially hundreds of thousands of environments, roles, privileges, policies, inline policies, it is a losing battle. Why not go to a method of zero standing privileges? That meaning, if you have to have a user account, you have no privileges until you actually need them. When you need them, you can check them out. You can use them for as long as you want, and you give them back. Anybody who's ever been in the military, it's a very similar idea. I used to work on a nuclear submarine. We had roving watches on top, and we had service duty guns. We didn't say, hey, roving watch, you have duty in 8 days. Let me go ahead and give you this gun. I'm not going to give you bullets, but you just have the gun because it's part of your role. Go ahead and keep it. We had a method of when you needed the gun, you checked it out, you got the bullets you needed, you stood your watch, you checked the gun back in, right? We need to move fast. So to me, least privilege is that idea of let's try to get to some sort of RBAC. And that's where I do have beef, because in the cloud, as I just completely mentioned, sometimes you don't even need user accounts. I can give you a user account on demand when you need it with the access it needs and then take it away. That reduces risk. I would love to hear someone argue the other side of that. Are you prepared for that, Jim or Jeff? Would you argue? I want to hear just someone argue against zero standing privileges.
Sorry, it's Jeff's turn.
I think it's a great idea, and I think I don't know anybody who would argue against it, other than the fact that in the real world it might be difficult to do from a resource perspective, right? I think the cloud is one thing, but I think of this, and this is where I was gonna ask the question is, so this zero standing privilege, we're focused on the cloud, but I feel like this is something that can also be done on-prem as well if you have the appropriate tools in place to scale and automate in a way that doesn't impact the user experience or the customer experience of I am within an organization. So it's very similar to password vaults and session management and kind of all that stuff where yes, there's an ID and a password somewhere, but the admin maybe doesn't know it because they're going through some sort of brokered session. I could see something, on the lines of AD groups that dynamically assign and unassign based on some automation from identity governance tool, for example, based on some sort of triggers, right, that are coming through either request or time-based or some attribute being fed from an HR system. But I think the idea is great, but I think people still struggle with, do they have the appropriate plumbing in place to facilitate that idea of no standing privileges?
No, that's a fair statement, Jeff. That was it. Great. So yeah, the cloud does give us those capabilities to move fast, to automate by how it's actually architected. Keep in mind, remember, large organizations, like most of you watch these new shows like Squid Game and stuff, they're hosted in nodes that are ephemeral in nature. There are no more servers. Everything is literally temporary. So it's just adopting that mindset. There are those who are quick to do it, like builders, and there are those who want to still have, we got to help get up to date with like identity. Role assumption. I would love to show a demo someday. Product agnostic of its capability is a very unique and cool idea.
So what is the Squid Games? I've been hearing about it and I have no idea what it is. Can you give me like a 1-minute explanation?
I have no idea what it is. I have not seen it. I've heard of it, but I know nothing about it, but I feel like I'm going to have to start paying attention.
I'll give you guys a 1-minute commercial here, and keep in mind I don't work for Netflix, so apologies. I was flying from LaGuardia to Denver 2 days ago, and I watched the first episode, and basically it's a Korean series that revolves around a bunch of folks who are down and out on their luck, who are propositioned with an opportunity to make money in a gambling fashion. Once they realize what's actually involved when you sign on to gambling, everyone realizes they're a bit in over their head. Very simple games that we all know how to play. You all learn as kids, but once you realize what's at stake, that changes the perspective.
Okay, so I'm hooked. I'm in.
Gotta watch the first episode, I guess.
Yeah, it's all the rage. I see all the memes,
Yeah, of course. So this concept of what is your cloud journey, your opening question, I kind of
Mm-hmm.
get from that there's a couple things, right? Because I've seen companies kind of pick and choose their clouds based on all those capabilities that you laid out for us earlier, right? They've got a strategy, they've got something in mind they're trying to build, and they figure, okay, do I need a race car, a minivan, or a rocket ship?
Yeah.
But I think there are other organizations that say, we got these data centers that cost so much damn money, and we need to take everything that's in there and move it into the cloud, and we're just going to lift and shift it right into the cloud. Is
Yeah.
that what you mean? Is that what the difference between those cloud journeys are?
That is what I mean. Yeah. So that's a great summary there, Jim. So one way I like to sum it up is, when folks engage with like Jeff and Jim now, right, who can give them an educated tour of what the cloud is. Do you need a race car? Do you need a minivan? That is a more educated customer. Where most of them, though, start off with the initiative of someone at the board level or at the C level has reckoned we need to leverage the cloud literally for cost savings, kind of like you're saying. And that's what we like to call the lift and shift. There's so much money we're spending on data centers and maintaining them and all that's involved. Let's just move to the cloud. And the cloud journey 99% of the time starts with let's move our on-premise data center to the cloud. So what does that consist of? That consists of moving servers, Linux, Windows, all different types of physical appliances, and virtualizing those into the cloud. And that is not a bad plan. There is nothing wrong with that. Everyone's trying to get to that goal. And they go back and they normally report to the board, we're in the cloud. And they look at the bill and they say, I don't see any savings at all. What do you mean? Matter of fact, this costs even more money. So then they come back and they take a look at it and they say, well, okay, if this isn't in the cloud, what does it mean to be in the cloud? Then they talk to Jeff and Jim, and you guys tell them, what kind of race car do you want? What kind of minivan do you want? And then they start to see those cost savings in the offload. And then they start to realize, wait a minute, we can architect what we're doing differently, moving away from those traditional server use cases, managing credentials and managing access in that method, to going to this serverless world of services. That's what we mean by the cloud journey. And then they come to you guys and they say, well, we've already done the race car and we've already done the minivan and we want to do a rocket ship. And we just found out that marketing owns this entirely new cloud system. And by the way, sales owns Salesforce and we're not managing that. That's the cloud journey when folks start to realize the full capabilities of cloud and they have different capabilities and advantages.
I think a lot of people in our space are struggling with, they built their conceptual knowledge of how IT works a decade or 2 decades ago, right? And it was all
Mm-hmm.
based on servers in a data center. You had these routers and switches and firewalls, and now it's all just a website, in a
Right.
way. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if kind of you could, okay, I have a few concepts in my head that I think are right, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is that you've got kind of that website, that console, if you will, where you
Right.
can kind of spin up these services and they have, and the services become addressable and I can manage what goes in, what goes out. In other words, like my firewall settings, all within a
Mm-hmm.
console, right? And I have to have access to the console to manage all that. So that's one IAM piece that I have. And with the
Right.
cloud, and I've got all those roles and entities that you talked about earlier. But then
Mm-hmm.
there's the whole other piece, which is now I've got all these objects that are running that I
Mm-hmm.
spun up. There are Linux servers and Windows servers and maybe some databases, or I got parts and pieces that also have more traditional IAM. So I think one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that then where you go is like there's the spin-off from there, which is then you've got the whole DevOps, Kubernetes,
Yeah.
Docker, right? So that's like
Mm-hmm.
that's more that cloud journey becoming more modern. But then
Right.
take it a step further, which is like something like AWS Lambda. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now we're talking out of my area of expertise, but it seems to me like AWS Lambda, why wouldn't, like, if I was building a new application today, why wouldn't I want to leverage that thing? But to me, like, this is where folks like me struggle. People who've been in the IT industry for over 20 years kind of, cut our teeth on servers and databases and directories. And
Hmm.
now it's like the whole world is changing. And I'm a CISO and I've got to understand, how do I keep all this stuff secure?
It's a Herculean task. That's one of my favorite comments overall. And honestly, though, at the end of the day, there are still things that are static and dynamic. Like you mentioned a Lambda function, and I like to equate a Lambda function to, man, trust me, my roots, when I started at Avexa, I racked and stacked servers. I wrote actual code. I know every form of SQL to normalize data, right, from different databases, to manage access, to build into roles. So when I think about Lambda functions, you can almost equate that to a cron job. Both you know what a cron job is. Cron job, just a scheduled task that has some ability to do some function. So a lot of the ideas remain the same. Ideas remain the same. It's just now there's a whole new world of vernacular and there's a whole new world of expertise. Even in the on-premise world, like I challenge any IAM person. Okay, you may understand Active Directory relatively well, maybe advanced. You know the port. I still memorize these things. I can query LDAP on 389, 636, 3289. Anyways, get all the information I need to provision access. I can give someone access to a Oracle database server. Now, within Oracle itself, am I a DB expert? Do I know how to parse the data? Potentially. Do I know how to trim it, prune it, do all that stuff? Not exactly. So when I think about these new advantages of the cloud, it's those sort of granular capabilities and services that folks are learning to latch onto. The only difference is there's no more moat surrounding that server because there is no server. Everything's accessible to the cloud from any different point in the world, right? So we took what was traditionally protected by a perimeter and we removed the perimeter. This is where IAM folks, identity folks listening to this, need to understand something very critical. You are probably the most important person in your organization when it comes to the cloud, because the only things we can control definitively are identities. Who are you? Can you validate who you are? Should you have access to these resources? That's not going to change. There is no way to fundamentally change that aspect of it. Even if it's a service account that we talked about, like a machine with tokenized access, something still checks that gate. Who are you? What do you have access to? How long should you have access? So those core things remain the same. It's just the vernacular that's kind of changing, and the spread of cloud is rampant. Every day, new SaaS comes up, new PaaS comes up, new IaaS is being spun up, Alibaba, Tencent, right? All of these things are happening, but they still have some core fundamentals that identity folks, we need to just step away from just being on-prem focused and start to realize, hey, the cloud's different.
That's right. You heard it here first, folks. We are the most important. And
The new
we've always
perimeter.
said it. Yeah, identity is at the center. Um, John, you've given us such a good basis here, and I do have one more question, which is, kind of pulling back to that ransomware thing in a way, but really more about some of the bugs that have been in the news relative to Microsoft Azure. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
kind of wondering what your perspective is. If we can kind of get like a candid hot take on this, which is, do you feel like a lot of these bugs that are happening in the Azure environment are because of the way Azure was built? Because I take that minivan analogy that you made, and I kind of feel like they took enterprise computing and enterprise data centers and spun them up in the cloud, and it's a managed data, kind of traditional data center. Now, I'm not talking about the Office 365 bit and the Azure AD bit. I think that's different, but I think the
Right.
rest of Azure, it kind of seems like it's like servers that are running that run a lot of the same kind of utilities and underlying OS software that people have kind of figured out ways to attack and penetrate over the years, and now it's just happening on a larger scale because,
Yeah.
I mean, shoot, if it happens at Azure, pretty much everybody's in Azure for something.
Azure, you nailed it, Jim. I like the way you articulated that, man. I'm over here grinning. I'm sure people can hear it in the podcast, but and again, I love Microsoft. The machines I use, I'm a Microsoft fan. So when I make this statement, this is what I mean. That's kind of what they did, right? When you go to buy a minivan, you have certain expectations. It's going to have a steering wheel. It's going to have a seatbelt. It might have a plug-in for my phone if it's new, right? And wireless, I can set it on there and it'll charge. But there's certain expectations of how things should work. And versus AWS, who had to start from scratch. And that's why a lot of these new ideas are radical, because they had no bias when they went into it. So in Azure, you see things like Cosmos DB, you see things like the RBAC side of the world, you see things like Office 365. And this is actually a benefit to most of the people that they want to sell to. They already know how to do this. I don't have to go recruit some Azure expert for $500,000 to manage my Azure environment, because a lot of it is very similar to what we know. And you're right, they kind of lifted and shifted some things. So as an attacker, it's harder for me to go and say, okay, let me go reverse engineer how S3 works so I can establish a new bucket for distributing ransomware, when I can just pivot over to Azure, which has the exact same server version from 5 years ago, which an exploit already exists. I'm going to go ahead and attack that. It's that concept of low-hanging fruit, right? So Azure did a great job in making the minivan accessible for everyone, and it does a great job, but at the same time, people know what's happening there, positive and negative.
Well, I think there's always an expectation of whose responsibility is it to secure which parts of the cloud, from a customer perspective. And we talked about this in our previous episode about, who is responsible. Ultimately, the customer doesn't care. It's whoever's data got breached, right? They're the ones that are impacted. But it's interesting to hear the thoughts and the takes on that, just because I'm a Microsoft guy too. I'm looking at my brand new Surface laptop studio here, which is pretty good. And if people know me, they know I like to test out technology. Maybe it's a keeper, maybe not. We'll see. Take advantage of that Microsoft refund return policy. So we'll see how it goes. But I do feel you bring up a really important point, John, which is it's familiarity, right? It's things that people are already comfortable with. And that's why change is so hard for a lot of organizations, because you have to learn something new. You have to kind of wrap your head around the assumption of a role. It's like, what are you talking about, man? You sound crazy, right? I mean, this is the type of stuff where it's like, okay, at least I get that and I'm familiar with it. And I think sometimes that's comforting for people, because they think because it's familiar that it might be easier for them to manage, secure, maintain, develop, whatever it may be, versus the unknown of, well, I don't know AWS, or I don't know GCP or Snowflake or any of these other things that are out there now, right? How am I supposed to get up to speed with that when I don't have that, that skill set internally, and maybe those resources are hard to come by, or they're expensive, or whatever it may be. So I think it's a really interesting point. I know we've gotten pretty, neck deep here into the cloud. And I want to bring us back up to the service area and start to wrap things up, because you've been super generous with your time. Before we started the show, we were talking a little bit about kind of the stuff that we do for fun. And one of the things that piqued my interest here was this idea of terrorizing bots. And when you mentioned, I'll let you tell a little story maybe around, what your favorite time terrorizing a bot. When we talk about bot, I guess it could be anything, but in the context, right, we're probably talking about a chat bot or some sort of kind of like AI or machine learning or something like that is doing some sort of scripted, triage of something. But I found that really fascinating, because I know Jim has a story, and it reminded me of a comedian bit that I want to play a little bit of at some point here that kind of gets into that. But please rehash your terrorizing bot story.
Absolutely. So shout out to my boy Keith Wilson at Attack IQ, Director of Education. Love that guy to death. We used to have our own podcast a few years ago, and we were always searching for content, right? And one day I thought it'd be hilarious if we had a little skit, little segment about terrorizing chatbots. Everybody's seen them. You go to a certain website, Charter, Comcast, whatever. And I happened to go, we used to like to pick on security vendors, and I went to a security vendor's website, and they sold endpoint protection. And it was more around just traditional AV. So I was used to doing this. I was used to just hitting up the bots and submitting random things to see what the response would be, right? Just different ways to terrorize the bot, like, how's your day going? I'd like to order a large pizza, nothing too offensive. So I'm hitting up this bot on this AV vendor's website, and I'm like, hey bot, how's your day? How's everything going? Right. I'm just chatting with him about how my day was, and it's asking canned questions. And before I know it, some real questions start popping up, and it's like a human, and it's like, hey, this is Jim. And I'm like, Jim, what an awesome name for a bot. What do you run on? Linux, Mac? And he's like, no, I'm actually a human being. And I'm like, you are not a human being, bot. Good answer, right? Just really diving in. And at the end of the day, I find out this was a poor BDR, a business development rep, inside sales rep, who gets paid to, make 100 phone calls a day. And he's over here answering me, antagonizing him as a poor bot recipient. And I really did feel pretty bad about it. And to this day, I haven't terrorized as many bots, but I think about it now. Is that really a person on the other side of the chat?
Well, you never know. I guess it could be. That answer of, yeah, of course, that's exactly what a bot would say. Right? Yeah, this is Jim in quotation marks. Exactly. I think of things like, SQL injection and how do I break this thing? Because I find a really bad bot to be so frustrating. If I'm trying to do support, I recently had to go through apple.com to help me with an order. Microsoft is the same thing. They're big reliance on bots. And it is so frustrating trying to figure out and navigate the menus. Riverside is is the platform they actually use for the podcasting, and they have a bot. And I'm sorry, Riverside guys, but your bot sucks. There's no way to actually tell you what the problem is. There's a pre-selection can of things, and it's infuriating. Great product, but the support needs to get better on. The bot isn't cutting it. Jim, how about your bot story?
Oh, we're so getting cut off from Riverside now. So now that you made that comment, but so my Delta bot story. So I was traveling over the weekend, including Monday. My baggage got delayed, and so I had an open issue with Delta, or I was trying to open an issue using their chat feature, which is really nicely integrated with your iPhone. It just shows up within your chat, just like if you're chatting with a human. But I basically just used the bot function to try to get to a human being. So I'm answering whatever questions I have to get to, like if you call in and you get a robot on the phone, you hit 000, and it's like transferring you
Agent.
to a person. Yeah.
Customer service agent. Help.
I finally figured out, okay, what is the path to get through to get to a person? And, on my whatever third or fourth try, I had this down pretty clean. The response I would get was, due to heavy call volume, heavier than usual call volume, it may be a while. So I had to wait for an hour and a half. I'm thinking, this is Monday morning around 11 a.m. in the middle of October, so there's no holiday. Weather throughout the United States is perfect, right? There's no heavier than normal call volume. Imagine if you actually called in on the day before Thanksgiving or something, you would be waiting for hours. But anyway, so the prop goes that I finally get to a person, had fantastic service. I really love Delta as an airline. Of course, once I say that, it's probably going to jinx me, but I really do. And I had great service. So then it was hey, please tell us, would you refer other people to use this chatbot? And it was on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being absolutely, I'm definitely going to recommend this to other people. And I gave it a 5. So what I'm doing now is I'm making good on that commitment, and I am recommending the Delta chatbot to everybody who listens to this podcast.
I'm going to go hit it up right now.
Yeah, exactly. I teased a little bit when I was talking. My bot thing is a comedian by the name of John Mulaney. People may know him. He's relatively famous, does some things on Saturday Night Live, or used to be a writer, I think, for it. Has a bunch of stuff going on, but he has a bit around not being a robot. And what I want to play here is a 90-second clip, roughly, of a bit that he did on Saturday Night Live as part of his monologue. They did it. I think it might have been 2020 or maybe 2019. I don't remember when, but it's relatively recent. So, but every time I think of, a chatbot, a robot, or a CAPTCHA, or any of those stupid things where you have to pick, which one of these has the highway sign in it, and which one has the traffic light, all the other stuff that, well, does that pixel count? Right? I don't know. But it made me think of that. So I'm going to play it here now for folks to enjoy, hopefully.
Everything's fast now, and it's totally unreasonable. The world is run by computers. The world is run by robots. And sometimes they ask us if we're a robot. just because we're trying to log on and look at our own stuff multiple times a day. May I see my stuff, please? I smell a robot. Prove you're not a robot. Look at these curvy letters. Much curvier than most letters, wouldn't you say? No robot could ever read these. You look mortal if ye be. You look. And you type what you think you see. Is it an E? Or is it a 3? That's up to ye. The passwords have passed, you've correctly guessed, but now it's time for the robot test. I've devised a question no robot could ever answer. Which of these pictures does not have a stop sign in it? What? You spend a lot of your day telling a robot that you're not a robot. Think about that for 2 minutes and tell me you don't want to walk into the ocean.
I love that bit. And it's become a little bit of something between my wife and I. Like whenever we see something that we're trying to log in, it's like, I'm not a robot. And we'll just text that to each other and we know exactly what the other person is doing.
He sounds just like Gilbert Gottfried in that, though. Which makes it even more funny to me.
It would be probably a lot dirtier if it was Gilbert Gottfried, but this is a
Probably.
PG-13 show, maybe. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, I can't wait until robots beat the test. That's when we'll change this conversation. Our robot overlords.
The Turing test. You could argue some of us already have robot overlords when Facebook went down earlier this week and nobody could communicate between Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, the whole thing. But I think that's a separate show and a separate topic. So let's go ahead and leave it there for this week. John, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate the insights you gave to us. I'll have a link to you on LinkedIn in our show notes for people who are interested and want to reach out and have further the conversation. I also have a link to Britive. That's BRITIVE.com. So you can go check out the fine work that John and the crew over there is doing. And I'll also have a link to the Protivity webinar around identity. What's the name of the thing that we're doing, Jim?
Of the conference?
No, what's the Protivity webinar that we're doing next week?
Oh, something about a security blanket, but it's about how to run a more effective IAM program. Yeah,
we kept changing the title, so that's why I tripped up on it a little bit. But yeah, it's around identity and access management for obvious reasons, because that's what we do and that's what we talk about. But I'll have a link to that in the webinar, and then hopefully folks will check us out at Authenticate in Seattle, whether they're in person or online. So we'll have a link to that as well. So with that, want to go around the room real quick for just kind of final thoughts. John, what are some things that people should be taking away just as kind of final words of wisdom to the audience?
Final words of wisdom. First off, thank you, Jeff and Jim, for the opportunity to be on the show. Secondly, you are the masters of the future, where with all this cloud happening, it's not a scary thing. Identity is the new perimeter. That should be the takeaway. Even though there's diversity in the cloud, we should look for a unified access model of making identity the center of what's happening.
Identity at the center. I love it. How about Jim, yourself?
When I started in the IT space, I was rolling out Windows desktops with cards in them so you could connect them to the mainframe. A lot of folks who were working there for a long time in IT were like, this is stupid. These terminals are all we need. And look at the world now. I mean, people don't even want to connect to a mainframe, period, especially without a front-end processor. We have to adapt and change, right? Or else we become kind of dinosaurs. And so we've got to learn this stuff. And I've been doing my best to learn it, hopefully somewhat successfully. And I think that, that's my advice, I guess. Everybody's got to, just put that effort in.
It is okay to get smarter. And I think that's something that people can kind of take away. That'll be my final thought this week. We'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for listening. You can check us out on the web at identityatthecenter.com. We're also on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. So with that, thank you so much, John. Thanks, Jim. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.